On the evening of November 27, 1998, 25-year-old Corey Parker pulled a pie out of the oven in the kitchen of her first-floor apartment in Jacksonville Beach, Florida. She put the pie down on the counter near the open kitchen window to help it cool. This pie was one of a few that Corey had made in preparation for Thanksgiving, which was the following day. Corey had always loved Thanksgiving, but she was really looking forward to the holiday this year. A few months earlier, she had moved from Rochester, New York to Jacksonville Beach, so this was the first time she'd lived on her own, and the first time she was going to celebrate what she called Friendsgiving. Corey and a bunch of others who weren't spending the holiday with family were all making different Thanksgiving foods and getting together at a friend's house on the holiday. Corey cleaned up the small mess she'd made while baking all day, she walked through the apartment to the bathroom, and she took a shower. After her shower, Corey did her makeup and her hair, and then went to her bedroom closet. She scanned the clothes that were hanging up, and she grabbed a pair of black pants and a blue velvet tank top. Then she picked up her favorite pair of black high heels, stepped into her room, and got dressed. She walked through the apartment, grabbed her keys off the coffee table, and headed outside. Corey locked the door behind her, and then walked down a sidewalk that led past several small apartment buildings just like hers. Each of the buildings looked like an old house that had a few apartments in it. Corey loved this spot in the small beach town where she lived, because this was the first place where she felt like she was truly independent. But she also loved it because the apartments close to hers were home to a lot of other young people. And tonight, Corey saw a bunch of them hanging out outside. She saw people drinking beer and smoking in front of their apartments. Her teenage neighbor from the building behind hers was listening to music on a second-floor balcony, and others were walking to their cars to go out for the night. Corey could also see people who had spent the day drinking at the nearby beach, laughing and stumbling down the street that ran in front of the apartment buildings. The noise and near-constant activity around the apartments drove some people crazy, but Corey liked it when there were a lot of people around. She thought it was fun, but it also made her feel safe to know that she was not out there by herself at night. Because recently, some of the women who lived nearby had caught a peeping Tom watching them through their windows. None of the women had gotten a really good look at him, but they thought he looked like a middle-aged man, and that there was a good chance he lived in one of the apartments. But tonight, there were plenty of people out, so Corey didn't worry about some strange man creeping around the apartments trying to spy on young women. Corey stepped off the sidewalk and crossed a small patch of grass to where her car was parked on the street. She got in, started the car, cranked up her stereo, and sped off down the street. She drove for a few blocks and pulled onto a road that ran alongside the beach and was lined with bars and restaurants. This was the town's main drag, and it was already packed with cars and people. Jacksonville Beach was a resort town that hosted a lot of tourists who came to spend time at the beach and to enjoy themselves at all these touristy bars and restaurants down by the water. Corey worked as a waitress at one of those kinds of restaurants, and she enjoyed it. It was exciting getting to meet and talk to people from all over the place, but when Corey and her friends went out, they preferred to go to places where the locals hung out. So Corey pulled off the main drag onto a side street, and a couple of minutes later, she saw the big lit-up sign for her favorite bar and lounge called The Ritz. Corey pulled into the Ritz parking lot, checked her makeup in the rearview mirror, and then got out of her car. As she walked across the parking lot, she could already hear the live music blaring inside. Corey showed her ID to the bouncer at the door, and then she stepped inside the club. And as soon as she did, it was almost like the whole place started moving in slow motion or something. Because when Corey walked inside, almost everybody turned to look at her. Corey was 5 foot 11 inches tall, and in her heels, she stood well over 6 feet tall. She was beautiful with long brown hair, and a lot of people who met her, especially when she was dressed up for a night out, just assumed she was a model or an actress. Corey didn't mind the attention, but recently she'd started dating a new guy, and it was getting pretty serious. So she wasn't at the club to meet anyone new. She was there to spend time with one of her best friends, and just to have a good time. Just then, Corey heard a loud scream over the music coming from somewhere behind her. She turned, and her face lit up. One of Corey's best friends, Tiffany Zienta, ran over, wrapped her arms around Corey's waist, and gave her a big hug. Then the two women made their way to the bar and ordered some drinks. And while they waited, they talked about their plans for Thanksgiving. And Corey said how excited she was for Friendsgiving. Tiffany said she was a bit jealous. She was spending the holiday with her parents, which was okay, but spending time with Corey and other people their age sounded way more fun. The bartender came over and handed Corey and Tiffany their drinks. The two women raised their glasses, downed the drinks, and cheered on the band playing. At 1:30 a.m. on November 28th, so a few hours after Corey had arrived at the Ritz, she got into her car and started driving home. She knew she had a big day ahead of her, so she had kept her drinking to a minimum. That's why she had passed when Tiffany had asked her to stay out a bit later and go bar hopping with them before heading home for the night. Tiffany was bummed, but Corey knew she did not want to be completely exhausted for Thanksgiving. Corey drove down the street in front of her building, parked her car, and stepped outside. She walked down the sidewalk to her apartment, and as she did, she felt herself tense up a bit. It was a lot quieter than it had been when she left, and nobody else seemed to be around. Corey approached her apartment, and she saw a few people out on their balconies in the buildings next to hers and behind hers, and this made her relax a bit. She unlocked her front door, went inside, and locked the door behind her. Then she dropped her keys on the coffee table and went to her bedroom. She slipped off her heels and tossed the shoes and her purse onto the floor, and then she got undressed, climbed into bed, and fell asleep pretty quickly. But just a little later, Corey woke up, startled. It was dark and she was disoriented, but she thought she heard someone breathing. At 11 a.m. on November 29th, so the day after Thanksgiving, a cook at a Jacksonville Beach restaurant prepped his station in the kitchen, getting ready for the lunchtime rush. The cook glanced at his watch and stopped what he was doing. He walked out of the kitchen and scanned the restaurant floor, and he got worried when he didn't see Corey. The cook and Corey not only worked together, but they were also friends, and so they would let each other know if they were going to miss a shift. So the cook quickly met with some of the waiters and other kitchen staff to see if any of them had seen or heard from Corey this morning, but none of them had. And one of the waitresses said she was really concerned because she had called Corey the day before when she had heard from a mutual friend that Corey had not shown up for Friendsgiving. The restaurant manager came over and he said he was worried too. He'd tried calling Corey a couple of times this morning and hadn't heard back, and it was not like her to just blow off a shift without calling in. The manager asked the cook if he knew where Corey lived. The cook said he did, so the manager asked him to go by Corey's place to check on her and make sure she was okay. The cook took off his apron and then walked out to his car and sped out of the parking lot. A few minutes later, he arrived at Corey's apartment. He went up to the front door and knocked, but nobody answered. He knocked again, but it didn't sound like anybody was inside the apartment. And so the cook walked around the apartment to the back, and he found Corey's bedroom window. He looked inside, and he could see part of Corey's room through a small opening in the blinds. He thought he saw Corey, or at least her legs, lying in her bed. He knocked on the glass and waited, but he didn't see any movement inside. So he pressed his face right up against the window to get a better look, and immediately he felt his heart start to race. He turned away from the window and ran as fast as he could back to his car and sped back to the restaurant. The cook ran inside, and the manager and the other staff members could tell something was obviously wrong, but the cook didn't even say a word. Instead, he ran to the front counter, grabbed the phone, and dialed 911. A few minutes later, 2 Jacksonville Beach police officers arrived at Corey's apartment. The call they had gotten from dispatch had been kind of vague, because the young man who had called 911 said he really hadn't seen much. Apparently, he'd looked through a small opening in the window blinds, and he thought he saw his friend laying in bed. And he thought he saw blood on her foot. So the officers didn't really know if they were dealing with a potential accident, a violent crime, or if the caller had just panicked and dialed 911 without really even seeing anything. And so the officers walked up to Corey's front door and they knocked, but nobody answered. One of them tried the doorknob, but it was locked. So they walked around the side of the apartment and they saw that the kitchen window was open. One of the officers told his partner to wait right there by the side of the house, and he said he would check out the apartment. Then he put on a pair of gloves, opened up the window a bit more, and then climbed through the opening into the kitchen. Once inside the apartment, the officer called out and introduced himself as a police officer in case anyone was home. But nobody responded. It was totally silent. And so he began looking around the kitchen, but there was nothing there that looked strange. There was no sign of a robbery or a struggle, and then also he checked the front room of the apartment, and there also was nothing there. And so he walked to the back of the apartment where Corey's bedroom was. The officer got to the bedroom door, and he saw it was slightly cracked open. Before opening it, he called out one more time, not wanting to frighten anybody if they were sleeping in the room, but there still wasn't any response. And so the officer opened the bedroom door, looked into the room, and was absolutely horrified by what he found. Minutes later, detectives Katie Kingston and Billy Carlisle arrived at Corey's apartment. They were followed by several uniformed police officers and a forensics team. Kingston and Carlisle ducked under the crime scene tape that had been strung up across Corey's front door. They walked inside and quickly found their way to the bedroom. The detectives stepped into the room, and immediately they felt just as shocked as the officer who had first arrived on scene. A young woman lay in bed, propped up against the headboard. She was completely naked, and her whole body was covered in blood. And there was so much blood spatter on the wall behind the bed that it looked like someone had thrown a bucket of red paint against the wall. As Detective Kingston walked closer to the bed, she could barely wrap her mind around what she was looking at. This poor young woman had sustained an unthinkable number of stab wounds. Then Kingston noticed something laying on the bed next to Corey. Now at first, it just looked like another bloodstain, but Kingston leaned down and saw that it was actually a pair of bloody women's underwear. Kingston heard her name, and she turned to see Carlisle crouched over, looking at something on the floor near the bed. She went over to him, and she saw he had found a gold cigarette lighter. The detectives walked the rest of the room, but other than the lighter and the underwear, nothing really jumped out at them. They saw some clothes and shoes on the floor, but they were not drenched in blood like the underwear. The detectives also found a purse in the bedroom with a driver's license inside, and so they were able to officially identify the victim as Corey Parker. Kingston and Carlisle stepped aside and let a couple of forensics officers get to work in the bedroom. The forensics officers were able to take multiple blood samples, but the investigators realized there was a chance that all this blood was the victims, not the killers. Then one of the forensics officers looked more closely at Corey's body, and he said the medical examiner would have to weigh in, but he didn't see any signs of sexual assault. And so Kingston and Carlisle theorized that, maybe Corey had just gone to bed naked, or maybe the killer had stripped off her underwear either during the attack or afterwards for some unknown reason. The forensics officer motioned for the two detectives to look, and when they leaned down, they saw a strand of hair on Corey's underwear, and it definitely did not match Corey's. And so the detectives believed that, given the location of this piece of hair on her underwear, and the insane level of violence inflicted on Corey, meant they were most likely looking for a current or former intimate partner. Throughout the afternoon, the investigative team searched the apartment and the surrounding area, and the detectives caught something that the first officers on the scene had missed. There were drops of blood on the kitchen counter and on the outside kitchen windowsill. The officers that arrived first had told Kingston and Carlisle that the kitchen window had been open when they got there. That's how they got inside. And so the detectives imagined that this is where the killer must have entered and exited the apartment. And so they hoped that the blood on the counter and the windowsill belonged to the killer. The forensics team took blood samples from both of those spots and prepped them to be sent to the lab along with the blood samples from the bedroom and the strand of hair they'd found on the underwear. In 1998, DNA testing was starting to evolve, but the process was still slow, and it was not always as effective as it is today. So Kingston and Carlisle knew they could be waiting a while for any test results, and that those results might not tell them anything. In the meantime, they wanted to speak to people who might have seen something that night or who knew Corey well. That afternoon, the detectives canvassed the apartment buildings nearby, and several people who had been on their balconies or in front of their apartments thought they had seen Corey leaving her apartment the night before Thanksgiving. And none of them had seen or heard anything strange in that area over the past 2 days. One neighbor also said she had met Corey's new boyfriend, and she provided enough information that an officer back at the station was able to quickly track him down. And it turned out the boyfriend was away visiting his family for Thanksgiving, and the officer was able to find proof that he had taken a flight days before Corey was killed, so detectives Carlisle and Kingston did not consider the boyfriend a prime suspect. But Corey could have been seeing someone else, or she could have had ex-lovers who were jealous about her new relationship. So, after getting confirmation about the boyfriend's alibi, Kingston and Carlisle got in their car and drove a few blocks away to the restaurant where Corey had worked, hoping one of her coworkers might have additional information about Corey's personal life. They walked in, and the whole place felt like something heavy was hanging over it. The staff were going about their jobs, but it was obvious they were all waiting for news on their friend, Corey. Kingston and Carlisle pulled the manager into the kitchen, and the manager quickly waved over the cook, who had called 911. Then the detectives told them that Corey had unfortunately been found dead inside of her apartment. The cook immediately started crying, and the manager closed his eyes and tried to fight back tears. Kingston told them the police would need to talk to everybody at the restaurant who knew Corey, but for now, they wanted to know if there was somebody working there who might have had an intimate relationship with Corey, a boyfriend or even a casual fling. The manager and the cook looked at each other like they were thinking the same thing. The cook said Corey was not actively seeing anybody from the restaurant, but there was a dishwasher who worked there named Eric Ely who wished he had a relationship with Corey. Detective Carlisle asked if he meant that this guy Eric had a crush on Corey, but the cook just shook his head and told the detectives that Eric did not just have a crush on Corey. He was completely obsessed with her. The following day, detectives Kingston and Carlisle sat in an interview room waiting for the dishwasher, Eric Ely, to arrive. Eric had not been at the restaurant the previous day when the detectives were there, but they had spoken to several other staff members about him. And almost all of the women they spoke to at the restaurant said the same thing. Eric was a total creep, and he harassed Corey way more than he harassed anybody else. An officer led Eric into the interview room, and he took a seat across from the detectives. Eric was in his 20s, he had long light brown hair, and as he sat down, he smiled at the detectives. Eric already knew that Corey had been killed, and so Kingston didn't waste any time with pleasantries. She wanted to press Eric right from the start. She leaned across the table and asked Eric point blank if it was true that he was obsessed with Corey. Eric smiled a bit wider and said maybe he was a little obsessed, but Kingston immediately went after him. She said police knew he was more than just a little obsessed. They knew that he had asked Corey on multiple occasions to spend Thanksgiving alone with him, and that even after she turned him down every time, Eric had made a huge Thanksgiving feast and then planned to try to guilt her into coming to his apartment. The smile on Eric's face disappeared. He looked at Kingston and admitted that he was completely obsessed with Corey. But he said he just wanted to spend time with her. He would never hurt her. But then Eric said something that took the detectives by complete surprise. He asked them how Corey was killed. Without missing a beat, Carlisle asked Eric how he thought Corey might have been killed. And Eric immediately got this look on his face like he was having a daydream or something. And then he said he thought the killer probably attacked Corey while she was tired or sleeping and stabbed her. The detectives both looked stunned. Eric had just described, at least in a general way, how Corey had actually been murdered. So Kingston said it sounded like Eric knew a lot about the murder. And what Eric said next stunned the detectives even more. Eric smiled again and told them that maybe he knew how the killer did it because he had fantasized about doing the same things. Kingston asked in a calm voice what kind of fantasies Eric had, and Eric said sometimes he fantasized about raping and murdering women. But before the detectives could even react, Eric said those were just fantasies. He never acted on them, and he never hurt Corey. Kingston and Carlisle talked to Eric for a while longer, and then they ended the interview. They told him he could go, but they made it clear he should not leave town. An officer came in and escorted Eric out of the interview room, and for a second, Kingston and Carlisle just sat there without talking. Neither of them had ever had an interview go like this. They'd never seen anyone discuss their secret desire to rape and kill so easily, especially when they were claiming they didn't do anything. There was no question in their minds that Eric was their best lead by far, but they also knew that they couldn't arrest him just because he had dark and violent thoughts. So they just hoped when the DNA results came in, they would have a clearer idea if Eric was the killer. But in the meantime, they wanted to get a better idea of Corey's last few hours alive. So they talked to some of her friends and eventually tracked down Tiffany Zienta, Corey's friend who had been at the Ritz with her on the night before Thanksgiving, and as far as police knew, was the last person to see Corey alive. In the week following Corey's murder, Kingston and Carlisle sat down with Tiffany in the same interview room where they had met with Eric. But the situation was a lot more relaxed, and the detectives told Tiffany they were just trying to get a better picture of Corey's movements on the night before Thanksgiving. Tiffany told them she had met Corey at the club and said they went there together a lot. And then, without any prompting, Tiffany started talking about how beautiful Corey was and what an amazing person she was, and how being around her was just different than being around other people. The detective smiled, nodded, and listened, but both of them thought the same thing. It It was completely normal for someone to talk about how great and how pretty one of their friends was, but something in the way Tiffany spoke about Corey felt different than that. So when Tiffany stopped talking, Kingston asked if she and Corey had been more than just friends. Did they ever have an intimate relationship? But Tiffany shook her head and almost laughed. She said no, she and Corey were just really good friends, they had a lot in common, and they loved hanging out together. Then Kingston asked when Tiffany had last seen Corey. At this, Tiffany lowered her head, and it was clear she was starting to cry. She said they left the club sometime around 1:30 a.m., and she asked Corey to go have some late-night drinks with her and a few other friends, but Corey had said she just wanted to go home. Tiffany said she called Corey around 2:15 a.m. just to make sure she had gotten home safely, but nobody answered. Tiffany figured Corey had already gone to bed, and so that's why she didn't try calling back again. The detectives thanked Tiffany for coming in and told her they would follow up with her soon. Tiffany said she would do everything she could to help, and then she left. But in the days following the interview, the detectives worked with the phone company and retrieved all of Corey's recent phone records, and despite what Tiffany had said, there was no record of her calling Corey at 2:15 a.m. or any time after they supposedly left the club. And so after finding that out, Kingston and Carlisle wanted to speak to Tiffany again right away. But when they called Tiffany, they discovered she had left town. And soon after that, they were told by the lawyer she'd just hired that Tiffany would no longer help with their investigation. Detectives Kingston and Carlisle spent the next few weeks pursuing any lead that might provide more information on the obsessed dishwasher Eric or on Corey's friend Tiffany. And they had conversations with a lot of different people that made both of their suspects seem totally viable. But the detectives still did not have any concrete evidence linking either suspect to the crime scene or to Corey's murder. Then, Kingston and Carlisle finally got the test results back that they had been waiting for from the crime lab. And these tests showed that DNA from the hair found on Corey's underwear and from the blood on the kitchen counter and the outside kitchen windowsill belonged to the same person. And that person was not Corey. But the DNA did not match any samples the crime lab had on file or any samples that had been entered into the FBI's national DNA database. So this meant the police had proof that another person had been in Corey's apartment on the night she was killed, but they had no idea who that person was. Still, Kingston and Carlisle thought they were getting close to finding the killer, and after several more interviews, they believed they had zeroed in on one particular suspect and that they had enough proof to arrest someone. However, the district attorney did not agree. He told them that without proof of who the DNA found in the house belonged to, or some other smoking gun, this case would never hold up in court. This news from the district attorney felt like a gut punch to Kingston and Carlisle. And no matter who they talked to or what information they got, they could not find the type of evidence that would enable them to make an arrest. And so the investigation started to slow down, and Kingston and Carlisle started to run out of options. The case remained open, but it was no longer the department's top priority, and Kingston and Carlisle had to focus on other work. In late May of 2000, about 18 months after Corey's murder, a man named William Rensler sat on the dock of a lake near Jacksonville Beach, fishing with two of his friends. Rensler referred to himself as a fugitive specialist, but most people called him a bounty hunter. Rensler had tracked down criminals and bail jumpers, and he was skilled at finding people who had seemingly disappeared. Recently, Jacksonville Beach police had put up a reward of $20,000 for anyone who could provide information that would lead to an arrest in Corey's murder. And once Rensler started looking into the past investigation, he became confident he could close the case, bring Corey's family some peace, and collect the reward money. Rensler laid his fishing rod down on the dock. He grabbed a beer from a cooler sitting next to him, he cracked it open, and then pulled out a thick file folder from his leather bag. He sipped from his beer and started looking over his notes on Corey's murder. Rensler's two friends, like everybody in town, knew about the case. They took a seat next to Rensler on the dock, they each grabbed a beer too, and asked him how it was going. Was he close to finding the killer? Rensler said he had interviewed a bunch of people connected to the case, but there was one person he really wanted to talk to that he just couldn't find. He pointed to this person's name in his notes, and both of his friends almost spit out their drinks. Rensler asked what was going on, and his friends said they both knew the person he was looking for because they had worked with them at a restaurant. and they told Rensselaer there was something really weird about this person. Rensselaer's friends said this person had come into the restaurant one day and said they had to quit and leave town immediately because their child had tragically died in Texas. Rensselaer asked, what was so weird about that? That sounded horrible. But one of his friends said he had gotten to know this person pretty well, and he was almost positive that they did not have children. Rensselaer took a swig of his beer and then asked his friends if they remembered when all this happened. And one of them said, this person he was looking for had left town around Thanksgiving about 1.5 years ago, not long after Corey Parker's murder. It would take a couple of months, but Rensselaer, the fugitive specialist, tracked down this person who had skipped town soon after Corey's murder. Rensselaer had traced their movements to Texas and then eventually discovered they had moved to a town in Maryland about 800 miles away from Jacksonville Beach. Once Rensselaer had this information, he informed detectives Kingston and Carlisle where this possible suspect was now living, and the detectives caught the next flight to Maryland to try to secure a DNA sample. On July 26, 2000, so 20 months after Corey's murder, Kingston and Carlisle sat in an unmarked car in Easton, Maryland, with a local police officer. The detectives were watching the suspect, who was smoking a cigarette in a parking lot while on a break from work. And Kingston and Carlisle could not believe their luck. A discarded cigarette butt was perfect for getting a DNA sample, because the suspect's spit and saliva would be all over it. And so they watched their suspect smoke for several minutes, and when it looked like the cigarette was about to be out and they might flick it onto the ground, they felt the surge of adrenaline. But then, Kingston and Carlisle watched in horror as the suspect carefully put the cigarette out on the ground and then slipped the butt behind their ear. The detectives looked at each other. The suspect very likely knew they were being tailed by the police. The suspect turned to walk back into work, but before opening the door, they leaned down a little and spit on the ground. Kingston and Carlisle practically wanted to start cheering. They waited for the suspect to go inside, and then Carlisle got out of the car, ran across the parking lot, collected the spit off the ground, and ran back to the car. A little bit later, Kingston, Carlisle, and local police officers delivered that sample to the FBI's DNA lab, which is only about 70 miles from where they were. And when the FBI conducted their tests, they were able to match the DNA from the suspect's spit to the DNA samples taken from the hair and blood found in Corey's apartment. The fugitive specialist, the bounty hunter, William Rensselaer, had indeed led the detectives right to Corey's killer. Based on DNA testing, crime scene evidence, and interviews conducted throughout the investigation, here is a reconstruction of what police believe happened to Corey Parker in the early morning hours of November 28, 1998. At about 2 a.m., the killer crept towards Corey's apartment, trying their best to stay low and out of any lights that were shining from people's porches and balconies. The killer made their way around Corey's apartment to the kitchen window, and it was still open. So, quietly, the killer climbed in through the window and into the kitchen. The whole apartment was dark, but the killer knew their way around well enough. So they walked through the front room and down a short hallway to Corey's bedroom. They reached the bedroom door, and it was cracked open. The killer took a breath and opened the door just a little more and stepped into the bedroom. In the light coming through the window, the killer could see Corey sleeping in her bed, and they saw Corey's underwear laying near her leg on top of the comforter. The killer got excited and started breathing heavily. Then suddenly, Corey woke up. She heard someone breathing and saw a shadow near the foot of her bed, but before she could scream, the killer lunged at the bed and ripped the comforter off of Corey. The killer could see she was naked, and they leapt on top of her. The killer pinned Corey down, but Corey's arms were long and she was fast, and she fought back. The killer didn't see it, but in the struggle, their gold cigarette lighter tumbled out of their pocket and onto the floor. Corey slashed her hands and nails at the killer and cut into the palm of their hand and ripped at their hair. Then the killer grabbed Corey's head and slammed it against the headboard. With Corey suddenly stunned and woozy, the killer reached down and covered her mouth with one hand and reached around and grabbed the knife out of their pocket with the other. Then the killer raised the knife, and Corey put up her arms to try to defend herself, but the killer just cut at her arms, knocking them out of the way. Then the killer raised the knife again and stabbed Corey in the chest. The killer pulled the knife back up and stabbed her in the chest again and again, and Corey's body went limp and slumped against the headboard. But the killer did not stop. They kept stabbing as blood splashed onto the wall and ran down Corey's body onto the bed. Finally, the killer did stop, and they looked down at Corey. They had just stabbed her 101 times. The killer climbed off the bed and staggered back. They could barely think or see straight, but they made their way out of the bedroom and through the apartment. They walked into the kitchen, steadied themselves on the counter for a second, and then they climbed through the open window, leaving a little bit of blood on the windowsill. Once outside, the killer crouched back down and rushed through the darkness to the apartment building right behind Corey's. It would turn out the obsessed dishwasher, Eric, who had admitted to having fantasies about rape and murder, did not kill Corey. And neither did her close friend Tiffany, who police thought might have been infatuated with Corey. In fact, the killer was not somebody who police had suspected early on. It was a 17-year-old named Robert Denny, Corey's teenage neighbor who often hung out on a second-floor balcony in the apartment building right behind Corey's. Robert was not the peeping Tom who had been spotted in the area, but he did spend a lot of time spying on Corey. From his balcony, he could watch her in her apartment or when she went out to sit on her back porch. Police had talked to Robert when they talked to Corey's other neighbors, but he didn't seem to know her, and his age played in his favor. Police simply didn't believe that this crime had been carried out by a teenager. But when police later discovered that Robert had left town not long after the murder, they did start to reconsider their thoughts about him. And they even wanted to arrest him, but the district attorney did not believe they had enough evidence to make the case stick. When the fugitive expert, William Rensler, learned from his friends that Robert had given a really bizarre reason for leaving town so soon after Corey's murder, Rensler became convinced that Robert had killed Corey. Soon, Rensler tracked Robert down and told Detectives Kingston and Carlisle everything he had learned about the young man. And so, the detectives headed to Maryland and secured the DNA sample from Robert's spit that matched with the DNA samples found inside of Corey's apartment. In addition to those samples, one of Robert's ex-girlfriends came forward and told police that the gold cigarette lighter found in Corey's apartment belonged to Robert. And finally, detectives discovered that Robert's own brother was in a Texas prison for murdering a woman by stabbing her 98 times. And authorities came to believe that by stabbing Corey 101 times, Robert was just trying to outdo his brother. Robert was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. To this day, he maintains his innocence. Around 7:20 p.m. on the evening of December 11th, 2002, a police department in a rural English county called Surrey started receiving all these frantic emergency calls. Now, all of these calls were coming from drivers on a heavily trafficked highway called the A3, and they all were saying the same things. They had seen this totally reckless driver with super bright headlights that was weaving in and out of traffic and going at high speeds and nearly crashing into people. And then a couple of the callers said they actually saw this car go down the embankment off the side of the highway, and so it looked like they might have crashed. And so, of course, this police department, after getting all these calls, decided to send out a couple of officers to see what was going on. When the two officers got out to the A3 and began patrolling the area on the A3 where all these calls were saying they had seen this reckless driver, they didn't see the driver. They didn't see a wreck on the side of the road. They didn't see any signs of an accident. I mean, there was nothing there. Now, had only one person called in about this wild, reckless driver, at this point, the officers would have chalked this up to a mistake or even a prank. But so many people called in about this one particular reckless driver on the A3 that these two officers decided to just keep on looking and really see if they can figure out where this driver went. And so to this point, the two police officers had been just driving on the A3 to try to find this driver. And so they decided they would park their vehicle, get out, and walk on foot on the edge of the highway because there were these huge forests that lined either side of the A3. In fact, Surrey, the county in England where this was one of the most heavily forested areas in all of England. And so these forests on either side of the A3 were very dense. You could not see very far into them. And so these officers were thinking that it might be possible that this driver, if they were driving as recklessly as all the callers made it seem like, they could have veered off the highway, gone down the embankment, and then because they were going at such a high speed, they could have crashed their way into one of these forests and basically disappeared from view from the road. That in order to see this crash in the forest, you'd have to be basically in the forest. And so these two officers, they pulled over, they got out, and they began walking along the edge of the highway, staring into the forest, looking for a sign of a car wreck. And sure enough, after walking for a while, one of the officers spotted something deep in the woods that looked almost metallic or plastic. Whatever it wasn't supposed to be in the forest. And so the officers made their way into the tree line and began walking through all the trees. And as they got closer, they realized very clearly there was a car. There was a wreck in the forest. And so the two officers, they begin running towards the wreck. They're calling for backup on the radio. They get to this wreck in the middle of the forest, and they're on the driver's side, and they look inside the car, and there's no driver in the driver's seat, but they looked through the car to the passenger side, and they saw the front passenger door was wide open, and on the ground on the other side of the car was very clearly a body. And so the two police officers rushed around the car to get a better look at the body. And when they did, they couldn't believe what they were seeing. It didn't make any sense. Like, what was this? Now, to understand why these police officers were so caught off guard by what they were seeing, we need to go back 5 months to July 16th, 2002. On that night, a 21-year-old man named Christopher Brian Chandler finished up his beer at a pub in West London. And for reference, where this pub was located was about 1 hour north of that stretch of the A3 highway in Surrey where the car was found in the woods. This night, Christopher had gone to this pub with a close friend of his. This was meant to be a fun night out. But, as Chris is finishing up this beer, he began to feel really antsy because it turned out Christopher was actually wanted by police in London for robbery, and so he hated staying in one place for too long. And so the only people who even knew where Christopher was the friend he was with at the bar, and then also Christopher's brother. He knew he was at this particular pub. And so finally, Christopher got so anxious about being in this pub for too long that he told the friend he was with that he just wanted to leave. And so he said goodnight to his friend. The friend stayed at the pub, and Christopher left, got in his car, and began driving south. But Christopher never arrived at the place he was trying to go. He just sort of disappeared and nobody heard from him again. Christopher's brother eventually would report Christopher missing, but remember, the brother knows Christopher is wanted for robbery, and so Christopher suddenly going on the lam and just disappearing for a while was kind of par for the course, and so the brother really didn't think this was a big deal. And also, the police felt the same way because they know Christopher is trying to elude them, and so it makes sense he would be missing. And so as a result, nobody really followed up on Christopher's missing person report. Everybody just kind of moved on. That is, until 5 months later, when all those drivers began calling into the police in Surrey about seeing this totally reckless driver careening down the A3, who eventually crashed into a ditch, and then those two officers, they went out to that stretch of A3, and sure enough, it was Christopher's car, and the body on the ground was Christopher. However, there was a problem. When the two police officers walked up on Christopher's car and saw it for the first time, they were struck by how old it looked. But it didn't really register with them why that would matter. It just stood out to them that this is a really, really old and rusted up car. But when they went around to look at the body on the ground, Christopher's body, they saw that his body was actually mostly a skeleton, which meant Christopher did not crash and die on this night, December 11th, 2002. Very likely, he crashed and died 5 months earlier, right around the time he disappeared. Now, the Surrey police, they say that this was all just one big coincidence, that the reckless driver that all these drivers were reporting that night on the A3 must have not crashed and actually just kind of got away, and then just by coincidence, when the police were searching that area of the A3 for the reckless driver, they happened upon Chris and his car. But remember, several of the drivers who called in that night about seeing this reckless driver on the A3, they specifically said they saw the car veer off the embankment and crash down below near the tree line. Like, this is a serious crash. Someone needs to get out here with an ambulance because probably someone's hurt. And then when the police got out and searched the exact area where this crash supposedly happened, they find Chris's car that had all the hallmarks of a car that was driving recklessly on the A3 that veered off and crashed into the woods. I mean, they found Chris and his car because of these calls, but it could not have been Chris. But what other car could it have been? As of today, we do not have a good explanation for how this happened, and so it's been dubbed the A3 Ghost Crash. The next and final story of today's episode is called Rumble. Late on the night of May 27, 1995, a long-haul truck driver named Devin Williams pulled his gigantic refrigerated semi-truck into a truck stop in a city called Kingman, Arizona. After putting his truck in park, Devin reached over and grabbed his sleeping bag off the passenger seat and began to unroll it. Devin would normally get out and use the bathroom and brush his teeth before going to sleep for the night, but this night, Devin was so exhausted that instead of going in, he just unfurled that sleeping bag and then climbed behind the front two seats of his truck and got into what's called the sleeper cab, which is an area behind the front two seats in the cab where drivers can lay down and rest. Devin had been on the road for the last 4 days, basically non-stop, and all he wanted to do was just finish the stupid route and get back home to his wife, Mary Lou, and their 3 kids in the tiny town of Americus in Kansas. Devin hated being away from his family for long periods of time, which unfortunately was part of his job, being a long-haul truck driver. But they needed the money because he and his wife had just bought a new house and it was a total fixer-upper, and so they needed to do a whole bunch of repairs to turn that house into a home. And so, missing his family and just wishing he was done with this route, Devin laid in his sleeping bag in the sleeper cab trying to fall asleep, but he just couldn't. And unfortunately, as Devin knew, if he didn't sleep this night, then he would have to take another break later on this route to rest because he couldn't just continue to drive with absolutely no sleep. And so taking an additional break that he was not prepping for could affect his ability to get home on time. It was Saturday night, and the strawberries and lettuce that Devin was hauling inside of his truck were due in Kansas City, Missouri, 1,300 miles away, on Monday morning. And so Devin began doing the math in his head. If he stopped a little while later to take another sleep break, would he still be able to cover those 1,300 miles by Monday? And he just wasn't sure. Everybody at the trucking company where Devin worked knew the 29-year-old as being very easygoing and good-natured. Trucking was very hard. People drove insanely long hours on very little sleep, and some people even took drugs to stay awake even longer to make sure they hit their deadlines. And so truckers have kind of earned the reputation of being very rough and tough people. And Devin certainly looked rough and tough. He was this big guy who wore cowboy hats, he had a big Fu Manchu mustache, he had tattoos. But in reality, despite how he looked, he was actually like a gentle giant. And really all he talked about were his kids, who he was totally devoted to. The only time anyone at this company saw Devin get mad was when his work interfered with his ability to see his family. And now, as Devin tossed and turned inside of his sleeper cab, he was getting mad because he was thinking this stupid route and his inability to sleep during this particular break was very likely going to interfere with seeing his family. And after an hour of Devin getting angrier and so not sleeping at all, he finally just gave up on sleep. He chucked his sleeping bag, he climbed out of the cab, and he headed into the truck stop where he went to the bathroom, he got a bite to eat, and then he called his boss, and he told him that he had just made a stop in order to sleep, but he couldn't, and so he was just gonna hit the road again. But don't worry, even though I need another break in order to sleep, I will be in Kansas City on Monday morning with this delivery on time. After speaking to his boss, Devin left the truck stop, climbed back into his truck, he fired it up, and then before long, he was back on the highway, driving east. Devin's boss was a guy named Tom Wilson, and he didn't find anything unusual about this phone call he got from Devin. Maybe it was a little unusual that Devin was unable to sleep, and that he called his boss to say he was unable to sleep, but Devin sounded totally normal. And so that night, Tom was not worried at all that Devin would not make it to Kansas City by Monday morning. Devin was like one of his most reliable guys, and so if Devin said he was going to be there on Monday morning, even if he needed extra breaks along the way, then he would be there on Monday morning. But on Monday morning, the distribution center in Kansas City, Missouri, where Devin was supposed to go and drop off the lettuce and strawberries, called Tom Wilson and they said, "Hey, your driver's not here yet. What's going on?" Now, at first, Tom was actually really annoyed with the distribution center because he felt like, okay, the clock has just struck the deadline. Devin will likely arrive in the next few minutes and they're prematurely calling to complain. And so Tom communicated that to the distribution center and they said, okay, fine, we'll wait a little bit longer. But when almost an hour passed and still Devin had not shown up, the distribution center called Tom back and said, "Hey, he's not here." Now, after the second call, Tom totally changed his mindset, and he was actually now worried about Devin. And so he apologized to the distribution center and said he would get in touch with Devin as soon as he could and figure out where their shipment was. But Tom couldn't just call Devin and ask where he was and what was going on, because this was back in 1995. They didn't have cell phones, and so Tom basically just had to wait for Devin, who's out on the road somewhere, to stop somewhere and call Tom to tell Tom what's going on. And so all day Monday, Tom sat at his desk waiting for a call from Devin. And when he didn't get a call from Devin, Tom began calling his other drivers all over the country, asking them if maybe they had had some sort of interaction with Devin and knew where he was and why he had not made it to Kansas City on time. But none of the drivers had any idea what was going on with Devin. No one had spoken to him. Then that evening, Tom got a call, but it was not from Devin. It was from Devin's wife, Mary Lou. And she was calling to say, "Where's Devin? He was supposed to be home by now, and he's not. I haven't heard from him in days. What's going on?" And at this, Tom suddenly thought, okay, we have a real problem here. And so when Tom explained to Mary Lou what was going on with Devin, how he had missed this deadline, Mary Lou panicked and immediately called the police. A little while later, a police officer in Americus, Kansas, arrived at Mary Lou's house to take down the missing person report. And after they did that, the deputy assured Mary Lou that very likely her husband would be found and he would be just fine. And so they explained to Mary Lou that what they would do is put out an alert to all the different police departments that fell kind of roughly along the route that Devin's truck had been on and see if any of them had had some sort of interaction with Devin. You know, maybe he got into an accident, maybe his truck broke down and he was stranded somewhere, maybe he was hospitalized, who knows? But very likely one of these police departments would know where Devin was. And sure enough, after this alert went out, the officer got a call back very quickly from a sheriff's department in a place called Coconino County, Arizona. Coconino County was located 200 miles to the east of Kingman, Arizona, which was where Devin had been on Saturday night but couldn't sleep and then called his boss to say he was going to hit the road again. But interestingly, the sheriff's department in Coconino County made it very clear to the police officer in Americus, Kansas, that they had no idea where Devin was, but they definitely knew where his truck was. In fact, basically everybody in Coconino County knew where Devin's truck was. It was all anybody in that county was talking about. Because on Sunday, so the day before Devin was reported missing, somebody driving Devin's truck spent the entire day terrorizing hikers and campers inside of the Tonto National Forest in Coconino County. The Tonto National Forest, which is 600,000 acres of just rugged wilderness preserve, was nowhere near Devin's trucking route. In fact, it wasn't near any trucking route ever. It's like 20 miles off of the highway, and the roads in the forest are barely wide enough to support small cars going through, let alone a 48-foot long, massive 10-ton semi-truck like Devin was driving. But on Sunday morning, so roughly 8 hours after Devin had called his boss Tom, 2 hikers named Lynn and Jack Yarrington were in their tent inside of Tonto National Forest, just having a nice time. It's peaceful, it's quiet, and they're right near this dirt road that kind of bent around a corner. And suddenly, they began to hear a rumbling sound coming from one end of this road. And so they were in their tent, they unzipped it, they looked out, and at first, all they saw on the road coming in their direction was this huge cloud of dust and smoke. And then through the dust and smoke came Devin's humongous truck blazing down this road at practically full speed. And at first, Jack and Lynn are like, how is this truck even in the forest? How did it get here? How did it actually manage to drive to this point? And after Devin's truck whizzed past them and blazed off in the other direction out of sight, Lynn and Jack weren't scared or worried. They were just totally confused. And so they began speculating, like, well, maybe the driver got lost and they're trying to find a place to turn around or something. And sure enough, a couple of minutes later, they heard a rumbling sound and they saw another cloud of dust, and it was Devin's truck now coming back in the other direction on this same dirt road. And so Jack and Lynn, they kind of backed up behind their tent, and they watched as this truck blazed past them again, flying out the other direction. And so in some ways, that kind of confirmed to Lynn and Jack that yes, this driver, who's definitely driving recklessly at this point, has likely gotten lost, they've managed to turn around, and now they're heading back out to the highway, and that's all this was. And then all of a sudden, as they're kind of chatting about it and laughing about it, they hear the sound of the truck coming back again. And they look up, and sure enough, there's Devin's truck barreling down the road again. Except this time, Jack and Lynn, they looked where Devin's truck was going, and they saw there was a small sedan coming up the road in the opposite direction. So Devin and the sedan are going to collide, and because this road was actually on a turn, the driver of the sedan couldn't actually see the truck, and the driver of the truck, whether it was Devin or somebody else, couldn't see the sedan. And so both drivers are driving towards each other without realizing it. And so Jack and Lynn, they jump up, they begin screaming and yelling at the driver of the truck to slow down. But the truck didn't slow down. It just continued coming down the road. And the sedan driver, he saw Jack and Lynn flailing their arms and trying to get somebody to stop on the road. And so sensing there was another car, the sedan came to a full stop. And then right in front of them, they saw this truck come barreling around the road. And so the sedan began backing up wildly, trying to get out of the way of this huge truck. And then finally, the driver of the sedan just cut the wheel and peeled off the side of the road into the brush. And right as they did, the truck, which had not slowed down at all, even though the driver could have clearly seen the sedan, just whizzed right past the sedan and would have smashed into it if the sedan had not jumped off the road. The driver of the sedan got out of the car, and when Jack and Lynn ran up to him to make sure he was okay, he would tell them that he got a good look at the driver of the truck as he drove past him, and he told them that the driver was just gripping the wheel, looking totally straight ahead, no expression whatsoever, just barreling past him. It was like he didn't even look at the sedan. He was just going. A little later that day, and not far from where this incident had just happened on this road with Jack and Lynn and this sedan, there was this family that was hiking through Tonto National Forest, and they had arrived at this big, beautiful open field in the middle of the forest, and they planned to have a picnic in this field. But as they came out of the tree line and walked into this beautiful open high grass meadow area, they looked out and they saw just kind of in the middle of the field was this huge truck that made no sense. How in the world could this truck have gotten to this meadow? They didn't know. But they clearly saw there's a truck, and the father of the family, he saw there was a man standing next to this truck, just kind of looking away from them off at the mountains in the distance. And so this family kind of assumed that the driver of this truck had somehow gotten into this meadow and maybe their truck was stuck, and so now they need help. And so the father told his family to stay put for a second, and then he, on his own, walked across the meadow towards this truck. And as the father got closer, he did see that very clearly the truck was stuck in the mud. And so this driver very likely is stranded. And so as he got close enough, the father yelled out to this guy and said, "Hey, do you need some help? We can go back and call someone. What can we do for you?" But the man who was standing outside of the truck didn't even turn around to talk to this father. He just kept standing there motionless, looking off into the distance. And so the father made it about 5 or 6 feet away from this guy, and the father just stopped and very clearly said, "Hey, I'm talking to you. Do you need help?" And at this point, the man who was standing next to the truck, he turned around and he looked at the father. And immediately the father kind of backed up for a second because there was something off about this guy. The guy was just kind of standing there and he was staring at the father, and he opened his mouth like he was about to speak. But instead of speaking, he just kept opening his mouth wider and wider until it was as wide as he could get it. And then he began wiggling his lower jaw back and forth as fast as he could, and then clicking his teeth simultaneously. And so the father just began backing up like there was something wrong with this guy. And right as the father was about to just turn around and leave and go protect his family from this guy, the guy stopped with his mouth, and then he just stared directly at the father and said very calmly, "I didn't do it. They did it." Now, when the father heard this, he was already so weirded out by this guy that he didn't even have any questions to follow up with. Instead, he just turned and began running back towards his family. And so feeling very unsettled, the family, they ran back to their car, they drove back home, and they called the police about this guy and his truck. It would take a deputy from the Coconino County Sheriff's Department a little while to finally navigate their way all the way out to this meadow where this truck and this guy apparently were. And when the deputy got there, they walked out into this meadow, and sure enough, just like the father had said, there was the truck stuck in the mud. And so the deputy began walking out to the truck, expecting to see the driver, this guy who the father had said was acting totally weird. But when the deputy got up there, he found the truck was totally abandoned. There was nobody in the cab, there was nobody nearby, it was just sitting here, but it was still running. And so the deputy tried to open up the cab, but it was locked. He did look inside, and everything looked very neat and orderly. And then he went around to the back of the truck, and he opened up the back doors, and he found the refrigeration unit was still on, and inside of this truck was lots and lots of strawberries and lettuce. So the deputy really didn't know what to make of this truck in the middle of the field, combined with this report that the father gave about this guy who was standing near it, acting totally weird. And so he just checked the license plate of the truck and he ran it against his database to see if there were any matching reports of missing trucks or missing truck drivers, but there weren't any. Because remember, this is on Sunday this is happening, and it wasn't until the next day, Monday, that Devin was reported missing and his truck was added to a list of missing trucks and missing truck drivers. And so the Coconino County deputy just called a towing company who came out and hauled Devin's truck out of the forest. And then 24 hours later, when Devin was reported missing, the Coconino County Sheriff's Department put it all together and contacted the officer in Americus, Kansas to say, okay, we do have Devin's truck, but we don't have any other answers for you. The behavior of the man who was driving Devin's truck through Tonto National Forest was so insanely out of character for someone like Devin that it seemed totally impossible that Devin could have done this. But both Lynn and Jack Yarrington and the other people who saw this truck flying through the forest on that Sunday, they all insisted that the man they saw in the cab driving this truck matched the picture of Devin Williams. But there was absolutely no reason for why Devin would want to go to the Tonto National Forest. And even if he did want to go to this forest for some reason, he should have known that his massive semi-trailer truck was not a good choice to be driving around these narrow dirt roads in the middle of this wilderness preserve. All we know about Devin is that at the time he went missing, all he likely wanted to do was just get home to Americus, Kansas to be with his wife and 3 kids again. That's really all he cared about. The police did consider that, maybe Devin just ran away, but that theory didn't add up. Devin had no criminal record, he had a great relationship with his wife, so there were no issues there, and there were no other kind of outstanding relationship issues with friends or family, and financially, even though it was a little tight, they were doing just fine. They just wanted some extra money to fix up this house and make it really nice. It wasn't like they were struggling to put food on the table. Also, the police considered that, maybe Devin was kidnapped or something. But Devin is like this big, imposing, tattooed, cowboy hat, big mustache, tough truck driver. I mean, who's gonna try to kidnap that guy? Devin also had no medical issues. He wasn't struggling with his mental health. He had no neurological abnormalities. He also never used drugs and always passed every single drug test that he got while working for this trucking company. Devin was basically just this totally normal, nice, well-adjusted guy with nothing to run or hide from. And so none of this made any sense. Police mounted a massive search inside of Tonto National Forest, and during this search, the couple, Jack and Lynn Yarrington, who had seen the truck barreling up and down the road and nearly collide with that sedan, they would tell searchers that they actually thought they saw Devin Williams, not in his truck, but out on foot, walking around on Monday morning, so just hours before he would have been reported missing. They said they just saw this guy wandering barefoot down the road as they were driving out of the forest, and they slowed down to ask him if he was okay, and this guy, who looked exactly like Devin Williams, responded by picking up a rock and throwing it at their car. And so Jack and Lynn just drove past him, not realizing that this was the guy who very likely was driving that truck. Now, the police, when they began this search, were pretty confident they would find Devin, especially after hearing from Jack and Lynn that he was pretty likely on foot and without shoes walking around the forest. It seemed like he could not get very far. But despite this huge search, they could not find Devin. There was absolutely no trace of him. And so, after nearly 3 weeks of searching and not finding Devin, the police called off the search. Then, on May 2nd, 1997, so almost exactly 2 years from when Devin had been reported missing, 2 hikers were walking on this trail in the middle of Tonto National Forest, right in the area where police had extensively searched for Devin 2 years earlier. These 2 hikers, they're walking on this trail, and up ahead they see there's this white thing right in the middle of the trail, just kind of sitting out. Now, this is a well-trafficked trail, and so they're wondering, what is this thing? And so they walk up and they see this white thing is a perfectly intact human skull. There's no skeleton, it's just the skull. And so these hikers, they gasp, they can't believe they're looking at a real human head, and they're thinking, how in the world did it get here? Why hasn't anybody else seen this and taken it? Like, how are we the first ones to see this? And so they would end up calling the police would come out, they'd gather up the skull, it would be sent in for testing, and sure enough, DNA testing would reveal the skull belonged to Devin Williams. No one has ever been able to explain what actually happened to Devin Williams, but the discovery of his skull inside of Tonto National Forest nearly guarantees that the driver of the truck 2 years earlier really was Devin, and the guy standing outside of the truck that was stuck in the mud in the meadow was likely Devin, and the guy throwing rocks at Jack and Lynn's car was Devin. People have put forth a whole host of theories about what happened to Devin, ranging from he had some sort of medical event where he kind of lost his mind and that's what caused all this strange behavior, or maybe Devin was on drugs despite not having any history of drug use. Maybe he took a really strong drug and that's what caused him to do all this. And still others believe that maybe there's a paranormal element to this whole story, that perhaps Devin was contacted by aliens, and that's what induced all the bizarre behavior, and then ultimately he was abducted by said aliens, and then somehow his skull wound up back on this trail in the middle of Tonto National Forest. And as crazy as that sounds, still to this day, no one has any idea what happened to him, so that theory is just as good as any other. Thank you for listening to the Mr. Ballin podcast. If you enjoyed today's stories and you're looking for more strange, dark, and mysterious content, be sure to check out all of our studio's podcasts. They are this one, of course, Mr. Ballin Podcast, and we also have Mr. Ballin's Medical Mysteries, we have Bedtime Stories, and also Run Fool. To find those other podcasts, all you have to do is search for Ballin Studios wherever you